Hey, Johnny.
Johnny.
Hey, that's tricks. The gang back together, huh?
Yeah, it's been a little while. Yeah, it's just telling Matt what my plan is here. That we talk about what we used to do together, what we're doing now, and what we think the future holds for the fourth estate.
What do you think, Matt? Once more, it's the preach.
Yeah,
Dear friends.
it's been a while. I mean, for context, we've all worked together in the past in PageFair, where we tried to save the open web. You could debate whether we succeeded. I doubt we did. I was CEO, co-founder. Johnny, head of policy, I think was the title, was it?
Ecosystem.
Head of ecosystem. Yeah.
Could have meant anything, right?
Circular, infinity loop. And Matt was head of comms in PageFair, which is probably the one area of the company where PageFair really knocked it out of the park. Was most known for it. And Matt's head of comms in Jentic now, so we're not here to recruit you, Johnny.
Not yet, Johnny.
Sometimes I encounter people who still remember the Adblockalypse, which we didn't start, but we certainly shone a light on with our reports year over year. So I think we're still a little bit remembered for raising the alarm about the ad-related gentrification of the internet in circa 2014, 2015, a vicious cycle. And that's where we were all working closely together. Johnny, you went to Brave for a while, right?
Did. I went to Brave browser. We were trying to save the open web.
Yeah, noble cause.
And you want to talk about media?
Yeah, if you're a newspaper, AI generated slop everywhere. How do you even know your own journalist? You're probably doing it, but you're doing a better job than everyone else. How do you rise above the noise on the web? It's full of this stuff. So there's threats there. I think if you're a publication of any type, how do you maintain your own standards, and how do you even get noticed or heard in a world where the amount of content is multiplied by 1,000? So you could get into copyright and stuff, and that's a set of topics here. You could also get into the opportunities. I think that established brands have a big opportunity to trade on their credentials to lean back into the real world, where I think people are going to start turning up to physical events again in the search for authenticity and trust that can be found on digital channels. And traditional media might actually have a huge advantage there. But you were once the head of innovation for the Irish Times, the paper record of Ireland. Have you thought of how would you be reacting right now if you were still working on that?
That's a good question, Sean. The way you define the problem reminds me of how I defined a different problem that was very similar previously. And the issue was you could get news, which is what we were selling. You could get news very cheaply, in fact, free anywhere. And it reminded me of the camera market, that change that we had when cameras stopped being an expensive consumer item. And suddenly there were very, very inferior cameras, but they were free on your early smartphone. So everyone had a camera. And what that did to the camera market is it polarized it. You had the free, cheap camera on your phone, and then you had the SLR, the expensive, this is before mirrorless, you had the expensive heavy body camera. And it made the upper part of the market more desirable, more conspicuous. To have one of those cameras became a big deal. And, it's part of that hipster aesthetic, the metal body camera with the fixed lens. So that still applies. In media, you've got cheap or free of low quality, and then you've got expensive, and it's far higher quality. It tends to deliver the message fairly concisely, but have a much better long view. The Economist would be an example. The Irish Farmers Journal would be an example. Does AI change that? A project that I started, but I didn't stick around to see how it went, and this is going back over a decade, was that our archive would be mined for context, and a reporter would receive prompts from the archive. This is back before the word prompt was known. And that would help them whenever they got a very sparse press release in, that would help them see if it was worth sharing. So trustworthy insight that was concise. Now, I don't know if they pursued that project, but there's definitely value to bringing the picture to people. One thing that was very much in vogue back then as well is showing people the process. We didn't do it in our paper. I think The Guardian tried. There were other places that tried. At Tortoise Media, who bought The Observer, they used to have weekly meetings where the public could come into the newsroom and be part of the editorial discussion. I think it's useful to show your workings. I'm not sure you need to democratize the production. Maybe you can democratize sourcing, but production's a bit of an art. So I think if one had got those problems, if one had confronted them and got the answers right back then, I don't know that AI would really fundamentally change things for you. They may make your life a little bit easier if you figured out how to use them. But the reason it wouldn't change things is a reporter is there and no one else is. That's the difference. You're not going to get the story unless the reporter had drinks late at night with the source. And there's no document that has the information. So the human has to get in to that other human's relationship circle and has to extract the information in a sustainable way and then package it up. Now that's something, if it's being done right, that will always be necessary.
At least the first part, where they're kind of spy, flying their trade crafts. The packaging it up.
You have an image of robots going through bins.
The research and packaging it up is already very automatable. If you've used any of the, like deep research or the thinking models, if it's written down somewhere, they can put it together and figure it out and research it, and then you can condense it down. You kind of need to still direct what you want it to do. And if you need some novel information, well, obviously you need to invest in getting that novel information, being in that pub later tonight with that Percy or whatever.
But Sean, just another thing, trustworthy. So trustworthy insight, it means maybe you feed the thing into deep research and it bounces it off your archive. But you do need the old graybeard in the newsroom. And the old graybeard is the one who tells you that politician was caught in a sexually exposed position with that person. And what you're seeing here, there's a bit of a misfire from the system.
The person has a mental model in their head of a very wide set of relationships, probably between thousands of influential people, and what their motivations are and why they might be saying a certain thing.
A mental scandal, yes.
Yeah, they bring that all to bear. It's not just information, but it's a map of all of those relationships, which is something that you can't currently get out of AI. That person's also bringing some taste to the equation. I don't know exactly what taste is, except I think it's more important than ever. Right?
You know when you see it.
And maybe for media, it's a very important question. What exactly is taste? Because what you have, whatever taste you have, is probably your core asset and the thing you should want to double down and start continuing and selling against. That other people can't so easily replicate, and that you probably have a long head start associating yourself with in terms of your brand and credibility.
This makes a lot of sense. There's just one hazard. It might not be a commercial hazard, but it's a social hazard. If taste can be interpreted to mean your culture war politics, then you end up with a cul-de-sac that's even more cul-de-sac-y. New York Times has been accused of getting into itself too much. That there's a rebellion by the young, especially the opinion writers, against the older news people, if I understand it right. And that trapped them in certain ways. And they just couldn't engage with some things they probably ought to have engaged with. And that's a problem because you get taste bubbles. There are fixations we've had over the last decade that we may not have in the next. And some of them were signifiers of where you stand on the political spectrum, whether you're kind or whether you're callous or whether you're fed up with too much pseudo-kindness. So objectivity that you're supposed to have had from the broadsheet newspaper, that taste, that's the really precious thing.
Yeah, that's true. If you're just a pure hawk, that's easily replicated. That's very easy for someone else to pick up and do. We have culture wars online, right? So if you're way off on one extreme or the other, it turns out online is great at that.
Bots are probably very, very good culture warriors.
It's unnuanced.
Mm.
I don't know what to do if I started a newspaper today. I don't know what to do in PageFair. Is the New York Times really a newspaper company or is it a games company?
Good question.
Maybe they listen to us.
Well, to your old haunt, online advertising, New York Times developed an advertising product that does the following. Matt, you'll like this. Sean, you'll like this. They got a whole lot of people to sit down in front of copy. And once they read the different stories, which were indexed, they then surveyed these people about their emotional state. And then they figured out what type of stories elicit what type of emotional state. And then instead of tracking people, they started to tell advertisers, you can find someone who's horrified by something that's just happened, and now they're elated reading a lighter story. There are many brands that want that person, and there are many brands who want the horrified person, and so on. That's really interesting, especially if you're not tracking that person. Now, you might say it's absolutely horrifying, but it's no different than what was happening with sponsored media in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s.
Yeah, it's madman stuff. From a privacy point of view, it's totally, there's no tracking there. That's just understanding the journey someone has taken. It's not like the Facebook example where they were doing a psychological study on their users.
Yeah. This is someone who they can't identify again. So they're not building it about them.
Yeah.
But they're making a guess about their current emotional state. That could have been done any time in the last 20 years. All they needed was a database of tags. And then, okay, they mightn't have been able to mine every article and automatically assign tags. But presuming this thing was making money, they could have done that manually.
That's interesting. Now you could do it with AI. By the way, you could mine this at scale, and without talking for a moment about any individuals, you could say, here's a narrative journey someone was on. They've read the last 3 pieces and it's hitting these different emotional balances normally for a normal person. And AI can scale that out, and it could be an advertising product. But of course, you still need people coming to your website. I think people are going to go to the New York Times because people are going to flee from slop as well. I certainly am. I'm abandoning large parts of my abandoning platforms.
But at the top smaller, the same argument comes in with artists or with photographers with Gen AI of like, people are willing to pay premium for something that's authentic and real, but it's making that top smaller and smaller and more exclusive to get into, which is not necessarily a good thing.
Not really that interesting. It's an interesting thing. If we were trying to pitch a story, right? Let's say you had a big thing, you want to pitch it, and you wanted to pitch a newspaper. Imagine The Guardian. The Guardian produces, I don't know what number of pieces every week. And you're trying to get in on the Wednesday. So however many pieces there are on a Wednesday, there's a lot, especially online. There's loads of pieces. If people stop reading the words, and if they're just listening to podcasts, they're probably really only listening to generally the top batch. So this is your narrow peak, the top batch of podcasts. So if it's political, you had loads of space in The Guardian, and then you had all of the other newspapers you could have reached as well. So actually, huge amount of inventory for you to try and get your message into. Whereas now you've got Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, and you've got, I don't know, a few other duos. You've got 10 political podcasts that'll probably cover the majority. And they only produce 1 or 2 episodes a week each. So you've gone from maybe 2,000 opportunities to 20. I'm making the numbers up. But if that's right, the ability to reach an audience, a general-ish audience, is just so reduced when things like papers go away. And the gatekeepers, if this proceeds, they're going to be all powerful. To get your topic into the mouth of Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, because they happen to be running a particularly popular political podcast, that is going to be worth an awful lot of money or something else. That's going to change things. It might mean we get a more idiosyncratic set of messages filtering through because it's going through so few people and things don't get rounded out. Who knows?
Of course, they get the news from somewhere as well. They're on specific beats. So there's a tree of blogs, commentators, particular journalists on certain beats that feed into the information diet. They get into that particular thing. And you can start somewhere, but that paints a picture of everything gets super niche, where there is still traditional media. Someone's got a beat, they've gone deep, AI can't replicate it. They've got authority on that topic. And that still clearly survives. And that might be a trade mag, it might be an individual. But that other question you opened up was, is there general media? What does that look like? That's a real challenging question, especially if in the future we are AI maximists here in Jentic. I picture a future where Siri actually works, right? A Google Assistant gets a lot better too. And these are people's personal agents, the agent in your pocket. So what it enables is, I want to know about the following, and it goes off and creates a custom thing for you, right? And finds the latest and the best and the most trustworthy, or the most sensationalist, or the most funny, or whatever floats your boat, and brings it back to you. It destroys that space where general media currently exists. I also know most people are so lazy that, even including me, when I'm at that low energy stage of the day, I'm not trying to think up of interesting questions to go off and get the deep research to ask for me. So there's probably someone who's going to be setting the agenda.
Yeah. DJs.
So how's it going anyway?
If you're in the business of trying to fix problems caused by digital, you're a very busy person right now. So life is wonderful. The problem is that the problems are acute and they've got worse and worse. What's difficult is to try and keep in your mind the span of the problems. But every now and again, they get thrown into relief. It all becomes really clear sometimes. And it became clear to me just how acute our problems are as I was looking at the Politico publishes a poll of polls where they kind of average out.
Meta study.
Yeah, exactly. They average out the polls. And I was looking at the polls across Europe and in Germany. So the CDU had won the federal election by 8. They were 8 points ahead, 8% ahead of AfD. Now they're within 1% of each other. And then in the UK, Reform is up 6. In France, I can't remember where Front National is, but they were maybe mid-20s ahead. And most shocking then, there was Poland, where PIS got back in the presidential election by just 1.8%, but they got back in. So you think of the market problems of concentration, of too much power in the hands of too few operators. You can think of that economically, and as you would think of it, Sean, naturally with your experience, you would think of it as a ceiling past which a startup cannot break. So it's a barrier to nascent competitors and innovation. But actually, it's a political thing as well. It's a democratic thing. And the origins of that antitrust movement are pro-democracy things. It's you people have too much power and too much control. Even back farther. Someone who I have a lot of time for, Barry Lynn, he often talks about the Interstate Railway Act in the US. And the question there was, if Johnny sets up the rail in one US state where we don't have rail, and if Matt sets up the rail in another, and Sean sets up the rail in a third, can Sean's freight run on Matt's trains on Johnny's rail? Is the rail even the same gauge? So clearly the state needs to come in and say, okay, we're going to have to agree on the gauge, and you guys are going to have to carry each other's stuff. And you're going to have to pay for it to each other. But we can't have a situation where the train stops at the edge of the state. Everyone gets off, gets onto the next train, and the cargo gets dumped into the river because, they work for another.
Looks like you're a state solving a coordination problem, which is certainly a role of the government, I think.
Sure. But we've ended up in a place where there's 2 rail operators. And that's really worrying.
Yeah, definitely. There's another AI effect here, which is 10 years ago, if you were looking at, say, state propaganda or whatever you want to call it, misinformation, at least it'd have to be human generated, right? So all the sock puppet accounts and everything that we were worried about at one point, there's a real scalability limit to the attacker's side back then.
Yeah.
And that's gone now, right? So just infinite amounts of AI slop targeted by ML algorithms against the populace for whatever ends you desire. Right. Step 1, hijack their amygdalas in microseconds. Feed them what you need to feed them. Yeah. And it's not even like a perfectly designed machine. It's not like someone sat down and said, let's design this mind trap for humans. to make them vote in one direction or another, but it's optimized towards that outcome now.
But that only works if you're exposing people to stuff they haven't already chosen to follow. So if you think about Twitter when it was at its best, you saw Matt's stuff because I was following Matt. I retweeted his stuff and you followed me. There was a filter. The filter was the people you had decided to follow. Just as, you decide to trust the editor of the newspaper, the editor hires this columnist who you don't agree with, but you read the columnist. So as long as we have this free-for-all where you can just keep forcing chum down the pipe and you've got an algorithm dishing it up to every plate, what you're describing can happen. There's an interesting opportunity now. In October, the European Commission is due to produce something called the Democracy Shield. It's what's called a communication. It's where the Commission says to the Parliament and the Council and the member states in Europe, this is what the plan is. And the question is, will that communication address this problem of trash getting shoved down people's eyes, shoved into people's eyes? And the mood music in Brussels is that it won't. So that's a big thing that I'm working on at the moment. And it won't because of a few things. When we were working together, we were interested in the collapse of media as we understood it then to be. Websites that spend lots of money producing news. And what would that do if that collapsed? And now that's still an issue. That's not solved. It's maybe worse than ever and accelerating perhaps. But on top of that, what I've been working over the last while is the recommender systems on social media. And that's truly terrifying.
So just feed algorithms in general?
Yeah. So there's a Europe-wide poll called Eurobarometer. Very well resourced. It's a European Commission thing. And they reckon the majority of people under 30 rely on algorithmic feeds for their news and their public debate. Now, that was terrifying anyway. But since January, those feeds are in the hands of companies that are in the hands of Trump. And all the indications from Washington over the last few months are maybe not he, but Trump land, Trump world, people around him. Who knows about him? He wants to boost authoritarians into power across Europe. You go from media's collapsing. Media, for all of its sins, wasn't amazing, but that's collapsing. In its place, now you've got recommender algorithms pushing rubbish into people's feeds and horrifying stuff into kids' feeds. And that was just happening as a byproduct of a particular calibration of the system made money. So that's why they did it. But now that system is in the hands of a political operator. And this is, I can't remember the plot of the second or third last series of House of Cards, but isn't this that? The Cambridge Analytica series,
Scary.
So life's good because it's busy, but actually it feels like we are really in a crisis moment. And that's more than concerning.
Yeah, I agree. And in lots of ways, shared reality is broken down. I don't think it takes the proverbial smoky room with the cabal in it to direct these kinds of activities. You just know that when a corporation is under the leadership of someone with strong opinions, that the corporation aligns in all those tiny little ways, all the million decisions that get made begin to align to that magnetic field to enact that. You can see it up and down with there having to be explicit order or control approach to create these effects. So the politics of the leaderships translates ultimately into the actions and the policies of the company. It's just a bit more banal when you think about it that way, which makes it scarier to me that it can be something down.
Hang on, you're suggesting a subtle, like an osmotic thing, but the inauguration was something different to that. Sometimes you'll see corporate culture rebel against a president or a government. But it happens fairly often. I think what happened was, in this case, before the election, Trump said Zuckerberg better do the right thing or he's going to spend the rest of his life in jail. On the record.
That we have in American companies highly aligned with the American government, and Chinese companies are obviously highly aligned with the Chinese government. And those are the two major superpowers. And this alignment is being used to project power internationally. And I think a really instructive example of that is to look at USD stablecoins. What's happening there? There's basically an overt attempt to destabilize their economy as well, propping up the dollar and subvert regulation internationally, to do an end run around other currencies with the dollar. And it's like stated policy, right? And that's like tech aligned with politics, so regulations, in this case from America, being used to project political power internationally through technology. AI is all a big part of this as well, because AI now has inverted warfare, for example, right? And it is hybrid warfare, and it might be the future of the economy, right? With the rate of innovation that can be driven from AI, all accruing to whoever gets to control the technology. So Europe is a very complex beast. The EU is a very complex beast, but pragmatically standing back and looking at the world, there's two superpowers. And for them, regulation is a tool, a political tool, and a way to project power.
Oh.
The idea of a regulation is a non-tariff trade barrier, which I think GDPR was widely perceived as such by America.
And ended up being.
Yeah. And so this is the thing with it, because you and I and Matt and PageFair were very pro GDPR. We thought this is complicated but idealistic, and unlike the EU AI Act, at least internally consistent. And it really came from a very idealistic place about personal privacy. And I'm sure there was definitely a camp in Europe who saw it as a non-tariff trade barrier as well. Yeah. And it probably ended up protecting US companies while keeping European companies down. And the way many regulations often backfire. In today's era, it's a very dirty game, right? And I think regulations are being used as weapons and as shields. And stablecoin is one example. The clear alignment between technology and government and finance coming from the two major superpowers is an example of this. I think a lot of people in Europe maybe need to read the situation and realize that it's not just about food safety and stopping toys from injuring kids, but this is geopolitics, and the question is whether Europe gets to even be in the room.
Draghi's latest speech says something very similar. It's this rule of law will save us, and being a big market will save us stuff. And that's probably had its day, right? That doesn't necessarily mean you depart from rule of law, but it does mean when your rule of law internally is threatened, you need to step up and act, which we're not seeing either. Europe doesn't feel like it can impose things on US firms at the moment for political reasons. And you saw very recently this thing from Trump with his threat. And the second reason is there's still a lack of confidence in dealing with tech. If you're a politician over the age of 50, there is still a little bit of pixie dust around this junk. If you tried to sell a broken microwave into Europe's market, and there was any risk that it could hurt people, that microwave would be kicked out of the market immediately, or almost immediately. And you would have to come back on bended knee, having fixed it and proven it was fixed. There's a webpage called the Product Gateway, where you can just look any day and see all the stuff that's been banned today. It's toy, and it blows up and weird chemicals come out and hurt kids' skin and stuff. So Europe is constantly saying, no, you're not allowed in our market. The big prize is to get in. Whereas with the tech guys, they're in. And very often the legislator and the regulator think their job is to help fix the product. How do we talk with you and help you fix your microwave? Actually, my job is to say, your microwave is really dangerous. You don't have to believe what we're saying.
I think a lot of regulators, definitely financial regulators, aren't really working with the companies. They're very much policing them still. I think some over from 2007, 2008.
Yes, but before 2007, that wasn't the case. They were lunching with them.
Yeah, definitely. I think, so I've been thinking about this with a few angles at the moment, that if you step back and look at the world, and by the way, I went down this path having read the Draghi report, which I misspent a large part of Christmas trying to read that thing. Right, so I'm a big Draghi guy now. That gives an interesting backdrop to the current situation, which is involved a lot even since September when the Draghi report came out because of Trump.
You're speaking as though you think AI is actually a thing. And presumably in many domains has loads of applications. I remember that after the big .com bust, there were real things that were left after that bust. Whenever about the latest little dip, because it's only a little dip, people are talking about a bubble. I suspect there's a giant bubble behind the dip, and they may not coincide. An absolutely enormous, earth-shaking bubble. And I'm trying to think of what might be left after that bubble as useful from AI, if it happens. Historically, after the .com bubble, we had credit card payments were now a thing online, and they worked, and there was trust, or an emerging trust, in buying online. A few of these things are really important, and a whole new system was built off them. And from AI, I haven't yet seen what the narrow application is that's going to make the big difference.
This is the stage you're at, right? It is overhyped. And I think you have to be pretty close to it to get a sense of the inner core of stuff that's real. And because you just rely on reading about it, it's hype, and you begin to see through it. That's our classes. The web was revolutionary and is revolutionary. So even after the dot-com bubble burst, which we lived through, and suddenly decided we can stand back now. And actually, as the Draghi report points out, that before the web, Europe and the US had the same GDP. And the US stormed ahead, led it, and it's embraced it, and businesses up and down, digitized and got those efficiencies. Well, Europe tried to stick with the Minitel paper for as long as possible until it just started buying it from Americans. So there's just a lot of digital efficiencies from it. I think with AI, here's what I would say, while acknowledging there's tons of hype, which is annoying to us because now we have to think about how we commercially survive through a hype cycle going boom and bust. But while focusing on the core, it's even in its current form, which is very, very, 3 years basically we've had this thing. It's and the rate of improvement is astonishing within those 3 years and continues to be. In where it works, it can really work. You just need to know where to apply it, right? Where there's a job that involves taking information content from one form and turning it into another, it does very well. Yeah. If you wanted to condense information content from something large down to small, it does very well. If you wanted to take not very much and turn it into something long, you get hallucinations. So going back to kind of information theory and what information content is in there, the scenarios where it works, the kind of translation it can do can be astonishing, which means you can take a document written out in English and convert it to software. And it'll do very well at that, subject to how good the specification was at the start, but it can turn English into software.
Well, so you're a gifted coder and engineer, and when you do vibe coding, you're in a position to edit what you're getting, and you can probably see very quickly what needs to be edited. Say, right, if I get it to write something, if it's some area that I know about, that's a capacity where you need a particular expert to be able to use it. And I wonder, unless something changes, are there going to be two tiers? There's going to be the people who don't have the expertise, who try and use it and produce stuff that doesn't work, stuff that's flawed, that might actually be damaging. And then there's going to be a tier who have the expertise and they found a way to speed up what they're doing. So that means you need a level of mastery for that application before you can actually use it beneficially. So it's narrow.
I think we might even be passing this today, right? At the start, you're just using an LLM, and yes, you have to be there line by line, checking its work, and it's helping you not have to look at the documentation or whatever. Say you're coding, right? That's kind of where it was 2 years ago. So it's still perfect, by the way. It can be very frustrating trying to code with this stuff. What I can say today is when I'm vibe coding, I'm not reading everything it produces because there's too much volume. So the trick is to try to find ways to steer it at a high level by creating more documentation and basic policies for it to follow about the way you want to approach different tasks. Basically, taking the expert knowledge that you might have and writing it out for it and putting it in a place where it's got some basic rules. It's always in the context window about where to go to find a policy that's relevant for a certain situation. So now you're in a situation where you're trying to equip an LLM or an agent, basically, which is an LLM running in it, with the policies that might need for different situations. You're extracting information, tacit information from the minds of experts, and you're writing it down. In the first instance, from your own brain and writing it down so that you can step back a little bit and just let it work away and look at its outputs in the aggregate. But if you can do that, then you have something you can give to someone else. So, for example, something like Lovable or Replit, or these tools that just allow people to do prompts to app, like is the promise. And they work surprisingly well, right? You don't need to be a coder. That's because it's not just an LLM, they've wrapped it up with all of this know-how of how to build the app. So they keep it on guide rails. That's basically the field now of applied AI or agentic or whatever. You take the LLM, you got it in a program that's calling the LLM, but it's going to manage this information. So basically helping look up references and policy information. And then you get tools, which is basically being another lookup or sending an email or something. And trying to codify that knowledge to make it available and make it into the LLM is the next stage to get to this level where it's on guardrails, still non-deterministic. It should be double checked at some level, and there should be sanity checks, and there's still lots of problems to be solved. But it's not like just asking ChatGPT for a hot take. It's like that level up from it. And so I think that's how you fix it. And it does allow that expert to decode their information somehow in a way that kind of gets packaged with the LLM, then that can be widely distributed. Whether that's tax advice or say someone who previously would have had to use free legal aid can now just get legal advice at scale, or medical advice, or I think what we'll see probably is a ton of homeschooling happening as people skip traditional education and get access basically to like essentially one-to-one tutoring during their most important years of their education.
You would take health advice from such a system?
I would in the first pass, yeah.
In the first pass, as in without a filter, without.
I mean, you use your judgment, about whether it's like going to kill you or something. But you basically have like an open-ended question, like what's this rash or something, right? Like you can get it to help you take a picture. It'll do just a stunning job of generate, depending on the quality of the picture. And then you can very easily verify the answers. But you couldn't have got to that verification step without a medical degree previously.
But Johnny, I think your question of like, what is one of those things that's going to persist after a bubble breaks, right? I think it's going to be a shift in people's understanding of ways of work. So it's this like incredibly empowering way of knowing, hey, I can bring something to a stage that I was not able to bring it to before. And it's like a greater level of creativity that it unlocks because it unlocks more tools. And even if you're not an expert, but you have some at least base level of proficiency in something, you're able to really do things that were previously just like never thought possible. So I think it's going to be a shift in people's perception of kind of what they're able to accomplish with a well-trained model or, with a conversation and their own education and knowledge from that. It's a really big shift. It's awesome.
There isn't an upper limit that I can see to where this goes. There's a current limit. They don't really have it. I mean, they're superhuman and thick as shit simultaneously, basically. Right? If a job involves putting one good word after another good word, they can often do really well. But if it involves having an intricate internal model of a situation, like a picture in your head you're navigating by, they don't have that picture. Another level to be unlocked there. The context is one dimensional, which is basically, have you read every book that ever existed? And you remember it? They can do really well. Or have you read all case law? They can do really well. The context is multidimensional. Can you picture the interactions between all of these things in law, or say a political situation, which is like multidimensional? You're like, what happens if Ursula von der Leyen does this? It's more efficient for the human brain that's maybe got a mental map of the thing to think it through than a thing that literally cannot have a map in its brain. But all the work going on for robotics is certainly some of that. Like, to solve robotics, they need to be able to do two-dimensional reasoning, not one-dimensional reasoning. All this video stuff is largely to create training simulations for the robots to be trained in, like a matrix for the robot brains, so they can develop this kind of three-dimensional internal visualization. And I'm not a cognitive psychologist, but I think a cognitive psychologist would say that the equipment that we've evolutionarily built up to allow us to have an abstract visual representation of a space that we now or a map. It's the same equipment that allows us to do abstract reasoning in general and to do it well. So today we have an advantage on these things in general, working with them. Like you're using ChatGPT or Claude or something for anything, even just for writing an essay or an article or something. And you start bumping up against its limitations. I think you're bumping up against that limitation. Now, it's very good at one word after another, one sentence after another, but it does not have the big picture because it doesn't have the warming to have a big picture. Well, you still have that, you have that picture in your head, but they might get there. Yeah. And you could argue then there's something else that we have that they don't have, which is these kind of eureka moments or nonlinear inspirational jumps, because they only do linear things. We don't spend a lot of time having eureka moments or insights. And most humans are getting by just putting one word after another in the most plausible way possible. Although it's like news for a lot of people who join framework thinking and so on.
You were reading Draghi. Why, Sean? What made you read the Draghi report? You're the one person who'd read it, so I'm very curious.
I should qualify that. I'm afraid I only got through 200 pages of it, and it started getting a bit repetitive. So the second half is what's like the first.
I found there's two big bombs, right? One is you've got this explicit red tape is bad thing. He doesn't go to that point where American lobbyists were saying your data protection law stuff is protectionist. He doesn't go back there and go, why wasn't it protectionist? How could it have been? Is there a way we could use? Well, I mean, he missed.
I mean, at least then you can have an honest debate about whether you wanted to use it that way.
Totally missing. And the other thing is, his report and DeepSeek came out reasonably close to each other. And DeepSeek does away with some of his ideas in that it's an incredibly heavily regulated sector, AI, in China, not just for political speech. And yet they're the guys who, if the US had a moat, took the water out of it and filled it home.
It's regulated maybe in some ways, but maybe you've got state sponsorship, right?
It's regulated in many ways, and it's not just political speech. You've got to jump through all sorts of hurdles if you're going to introduce a product like that in China. It's a thing. And in Europe, there is zero possibility you'll end up in jail. Whereas China, that's a non-zero possibility.
But I mean, Draghi's talking not just the importance or the potential punishment for breaching regulations, but just the quagmire, the sheer complexity of it, to the extent that European companies, we don't trade any services with each other. It's just too complicated. We find it easier to do business with America than with each other.
Yes.
But we don't have a single market. We haven't even got that far.
But that is unnecessary regulatory barriers between states. No disagreement there. The problem is that the capitals can't let that go. You know, it's not very popular to let these things go. So it's another, we're not a federal state.
It boils down to federalism and whether there's, I think he's pretty clear in the report, right? This is a question of political will. That in order to resolve these things and continue to have a right to exist, we need a common energy policy, defense policy, an actual single market. And this is going to be a more federalistic state. And it's going to be a question of whether the political will can be found across Europe, everywhere, to do this. Because if it's not, we just get 27 little Brexits. Since then, Trump has happened and now it's ramped up. So his political will being manufactured. Either way, in the chaotic way.
Or the opposite. It's the make or break.